Hello, and welcome to another episode of Architecture for Kids podcast. I'm your host, Antonio Capelão. I'm a trained architect, an architectural educator, and founding director of award-winning Architecture for Kids CIC. In this podcast, I'm going to talk to practitioners and creatives that share the same passion as I do, to inspire and to engage children and young people to shape their built environment and the creative industries. The podcast is brought to you in collaboration with the Built Environment Trust, the Thornton Education Trust, and the Welsh School of Architecture, Cardiff University. My guest today is Hester. Hester is part of the Architecture and Art Collective Public Works, a design practice set up in 2004, working across architecture, art, and performance. She's currently completing a PhD through practice at the Welsh School of Architecture. Working with Grangetown Youth Forum, the research explores how we could think with moss as a companion to better understand the natural resources of our urban environment. Exploring how we could improve the lanes with residents as part of the Play Lanes projects, she tested these ideas, thinking with moss as a more than human participant. Hester, thank you for coming to talk to me today, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really excited to be here on National Moss Day. So it's a centenary year of the British Bryology Society. So bryologists are people, amateur scientists who study moss, and this is the first National Moss Day. So celebrating moss, where all the mosses that grow in the UK, and thinking about how we can appreciate, learn about them, and grow them more.
What subjects were you good at school, and what subjects did you enjoy most studying, if they were different?
So when I was at school, I really loved art and design, but I also really liked maths and physics. And I think so I trained as an architect, and it felt like it sort of sat between those two worlds of art and design and maths and physics. But I'm very dyslexic, so I really didn't enjoy my sort of primary school. I found bits of it quite hard and challenging, and I think what art and design and maths and physics all have in common is they're not very language-based. You're drawing and thinking, you're kind of exploring ideas and not necessarily relying on reading and writing very much on.
What you were good at, I suppose it helped you to your career choices or where to follow your studies.
Yeah. For a long time, I was sort of torn between either wanting to go to art school and be an artist or to be a physicist. Or be a theoretical physicist, and they were the two things I was really excited by when I was quite little. And I suppose, architecture felt like a sort of a pretty good middle ground between the two. It was sort of practical and structured and applied, but it was also really creative.
And when did you decide that you was going to study architecture, and how that decision came about?
I think I probably decided about 13 or 14. When I was at school, I did a lot of work experience. I worked at a few architects' firms. I also worked in Bath, seeing their set design department. I really loved that. And I think that was maybe a point where I thought I'd like to study architecture and thinking I probably would be interested in going into set design and theatre. But yeah, I think that experience of being in offices and practices and meeting architects and talking to architects was what really kind of convinced me that I thought I wanted to be.
What was it that convinced you to be an architect?
So to an extent, I think maybe because of being dyslexic, or maybe that's just kind of what I'm like naturally. I really love working with other people, and I really like thinking with other people, working in groups and developing ideas together. And I think that was what I really enjoyed about what looked like the kind of role of an architect, or what an architect does is it's about working with a client, with a community, but also with structural engineers and builders. And it's that kind of collaborative practice that I think is really key to kind of how architects operate. And one of the main things you kind of do as an architect is sort of thinking across different disciplines and different skills. And that was something I really enjoyed, and I think was something that I felt kind of, I suppose, convinced me maybe that it was something I'd be interested in.
When you started studying architecture, was it in line with what you thought how the course was going to be, or how was that experience?
I did my undergrad at Oxford Brook. I think maybe a surprising thing about studying architecture, and it was quite reflective of that time, so just over a decade ago, there was a lot around sort of events and performance as architecture and how we thought about and designed events, and that as a way of sort of almost like as a live, real project that we could design an event and think about how it operated as a space, how it functioned, how people moved, what it felt like to be part of that, but also what kind of impact did that event have on people, and that as a way of sort of starting to think about architecture and design. So I remember my first year, we designed a cinema. We had to design a cinema screening, and we were all responsible in small groups to different elements of the evening. And I think my group was responsible for designing and building the chairs for the cinema from waste material in the architecture school. And to me, that didn't necessarily seem like something an architect would do. But I think that kind of, that thinking about how you make people feel in a space and what's the experience of being in a space was quite sort of surprising to me as a sort of starting point for how we think about what an architect does.
Let's talk a little bit about your trajectory since you finished your part 2 in architecture until now you are a student here at the School of Architecture. What have you done and what made you do your PhD?
So I studied my part 2, so that's like a kind of master's in architecture at the Royal College of Art. And I was part of a studio. So my tutors, Andrea and Andreas, founded Public Works, which is now the collective I'm part of. And that studio is really looking at ideas of architecture and activism, how we think with communities, work with communities within our sort of our studio projects, developing briefs with them, and then thinking through kind of design ideas in response to those briefs. And when I finished my part 2, Public Work invited us to think about how those student projects could become real projects. So how we could continue working with those groups, raise funds, continue exploring those kind of ideas we were looking at university as part of a kind of and as part of Public Work. So joining the collective, I applied for some funding, and at the time I was looking at social housing estates in London and the sort of green spaces of social housing estates, how they could be designed, how they could be used as sort of community spaces, as community gardens, growing spaces, but also how that growing could be a way of sort of promoting and supporting the people who lived in those spaces and protecting them against sort of displacement and redevelopment. So this kind of privatisation of social housing. I raised some funding and I worked with a group in just off Victoria Park, looking at planting a series of community gardens, setting up a series of community gardens with residents there. I think that was a really formative experience in terms of thinking about myself as a practitioner, but also how I worked as a group. So at Public Works, we think of ourselves as a collective. So we bring in work and we work together in sort of small teams, but we also have, each of us has a sort of a research agenda and an idea we're exploring through our practice and kind of think about how different projects can support that. And I'm really interested in ideas of ecology in green spaces. So our relationship with nature in cities and how participatory co-design, so how working with different groups can develop a kind of closer relationship with nature and support those spaces. At the moment, I'm doing what's called a PhD through practice. So you ask a question of your practice or you want to explore an idea in more detail, sort of disrupt your kind of existing practice. So I suppose for the last sort of 6-7 years, I've been looking a lot at sort of participation and co-design, so how to work with different community groups to support kind of create collective visions of how green spaces could be used and improved. And my PhD is looking at how we might think with the more than human. So and this is a theory within anthropology. It's quite kind of abstract academic theory. It's talked about quite a lot in ecofeminism, and thinking about how that theory might be applied to a kind of a practice. So working with community groups, but also thinking about plants and animals as part of the kind of participants in the workshop. And I'm really interested in, what did I learn? What's kind of challenging about that approach? But what did it also bring to these co-design situations? What's this value of thinking with the more than human within these sort of participatory co-design process?
How you've developed the work that you're doing with the Grangetown Youth Forum and Wine Moss.
As I said at the beginning, I really like thinking with others and exploring ideas in groups. And I think this idea of it's called participatory action research, but how knowledge isn't produced always in universities, but can be produced by, we can learn from, think with groups and people around the cities. I sort of started my research thinking about how we could engage with natural resources of the city and how those natural resources can become kind of a key element within a sort of participatory co-design conversation. But in particular, I'm really interested, really passionate about moss. So how we can think with moss as a sort of So sort of an urban plant that we can find everywhere, all around us in cities. What does it mean to kind of engage with this as a kind of focal point to a process, a kind of a co-design process? So moss is really interesting in that it doesn't have a root system. It's not what's called vascular. So almost every other plant is vascular. It's drawing nutrients and water out of the soil up through tubes and pipes into leaves. Whereas moss, because it's a more primitive, earlier form of plant, is always in direct bodily contact with air, and it's drawing its nutrients and water out of that air. And that's how it's kind of growing. And this is one of the reasons why moss is so small and grows along the ground and isn't like large and fibrous and woody like a tree. But because of this relationship with air and air quality, moss both filters the air, so it takes pollutants out of the air like NOx, which is generally nitrogen dioxide. Nitrogen is what causes plants to grow kind of green and lush, but also PM 2.5 and PM 10, which is basically like dust that are suspended in the air. And moss filters those pollutants out, so it directly improves air quality. And I first became interested in moss thinking about how we could design prototypes to improve air quality, which grew moss within them. But through that process, I also became interested in how we could learn from moss. So by looking at how and where it grew, we could start to understand the nature of air quality, and to some extent also start to discuss and think about our own relationship with air quality. So I suppose it's this idea of thinking with the moss as a kind of a teacher within this process. By looking and understanding the moss and its relationship with air, we also start to think about our own relationship with air and the types of behaviours in cities that can improve air quality. So, plants and animals, plants in cities improve air quality. They're kind of taking out pollutants, and behaviours that sort of increase pollution. So things like car travel, but also construction, the demolition of buildings. That's something architects are really involved. I became really interested in this idea of how we could think with moss. So I ran a sort of 6-month program with the Grangetown Youth Forum, exploring how we could think with moss. What did it mean to kind of, what do we learn about moss? What did these kind of scientific stories of how moss interacted with air pollution teach us about our own relationship with moss, but also more broadly about kind of our neighbourhood and its sort of air quality as a natural resource, as a sort of starting point to how I was thinking about framing my research. And so this kind of, I suppose, the way in which I currently think about moss is really informed by those conversations with the young people as part of the...
How do you think with moss? Can you give us an example, as well as what is the involvement with the young people in the project?
I started this process really thinking that we would be building prototypes. So we'd be building kind of experimental architectural elements that use moss within them. But the element of the project I was most interested in and enjoyed the most was actually working with others, so working with communities and building these prototypes. And what we learned together about ourselves and our relationship with the environment by thinking about how we could grow moss. With the Youth Forum, we started we're exploring a living lab. So a living lab is something that happens within citizen science, participatory scientific method, where you ask a question as a group and explore how you kind of answer that question. So as a group, we asked, how could we grow moss? There's very little horticulture around moss within the UK. When you Google moss, it comes up with how to get moss out of your lawn, how to kill moss. We, as a country, we don't have very much love for moss. There's not much care for moss. And as a result, it's really hard to... Moss in some ways is everywhere. You can find it, whenever you start to look, you can find it in the cracks of pavement, along buildings, but also it's never anywhere intentionally. We don't have beds of moss in the way they do or lawns of moss in the way they do in somewhere like Japan. As a group, we were looking at how we could grow moss within the pavilion. And so we built these tubes, which were put up in the entrance to space as a sort of living exhibition, and we explored what those tubes were like. So what was the air quality within those tubes like, and how did that affect how the moss grew? So we collected moss from different bits of Cardiff, and sometimes the tubes were filled up in the street, sometimes they where the kind of cars and things were, and there was a different air quality there. And then we filled other tubes up inside the pavilion. We also explored how much water we put into the tubes, and then over the process of the exhibition observed how the tubes grew. And so I suppose it was this idea of how could we grow moss, but through the process of growing moss, what did we learn together about air and air quality and our relationship with air quality?
How do you set up all these experiments?
And then this way, my research is actually not so much focused on And I think it's a really important question, and I think it would be really interesting to explore in more detail. But my research isn't actually looking necessarily at kind of mapping how well the moss is growing. It's more reflecting on what did we learn as a group through trying to grow moss together. So what did the process of kind of finding moss and thinking about where it was growing teach us, and how did that kind of change our relationship with our environment? So the sort of what kind of conversations we were having. And that really led into the Play Lanes project, which I've been working on as a kind of, so using the ideas that we developed within the moss, Breathing Moss exhibition, about how we could think with moss and thinking about how they could then sit within a more traditional architectural project. In a sense, I suppose, while the Breathing Moss exhibition was looking at kind of methods within citizen science, a kind of living lab method as a way of thinking about moss, this was thinking about how do I translate that learning? How can I use that way of thinking with moss within what is, I suppose, my existing practice of sort of participatory co-design? So the Play Lanes project was funded by Child Friendly Cities at Cardiff Council. They had some funding to think about how the lanes at Backlocker residents' houses could be improved. So how could they become more child-friendly spaces? And so we started with a kind of call out to invite residents who had a lane at the back of their house to sign up to say if they would like to improve their lane, to kind of think about what could happen within these spaces. And what was really amazing about the call out is actually we got far more residents signing up than we expected. So we set up a resident committee of people who weren't going to put their lane forward but were kind of living in the local area. And then they chose the kind of 2 lanes to be a pilot project for this idea. 2 lanes in Grangetown, which could be which we could explore kind of how we could improve those spaces. And the project was developed by something at Cardiff University called Community Gateway, and that's really based in Grangetown, and it's looking at how academics can work with kind of communities and groups within Grangetown on sort of live projects, improving their research, but also kind of exploring ideas or supporting community ideas within the local area. So we were working in Grangetown, we had 2 lanes chosen by this resident group, and we were thinking about how we could improve these spaces. And my interest, as I kind of helped facilitate the project as architects looking at kind of participation and co-design, but my interest within the process was how could we think with moss within this process? How could we focus on moss as a way of collecting ideas and thinking about a design for the space? It started when we first went into the lanes. We were telling residents about the project and inviting them out into the street. And we did a moss hunt, so looking at moss, what moss was growing down the length of the lane, what moss could we find, and what did that tell us about the existing environment, where it could tell us about where it was light, where it was dark, how water moved through the space, so what were the kind of damp areas, moss grows in really damp, moist areas, and what were the kind of dry spaces of the lane. So it was a way to start to kind of understanding the existing context. We also started to I ran a moss tile making workshop. So we were seeing if we could grow moss on a series of tiles that could go into the space. So that kind of moved, I suppose, from thinking about the lane, what the lane was like now, and then thinking about how could we change it, how could we improve it. And I was really interested in, what does it mean to bring a kind of ecological environmental agenda to a project? What does it mean to kind of think about a space of the city already as a really vibrant ecology, as a place that kind of appreciate the positive environmental quality of what's already there as a starting point for the design process. In sort of multi-species ethnography, there's this idea of sort of patchy hope. How do we fight in places where we kind of perceive them as kind of very grey and human and urban? How can we find patches of hope, of a kind of resilient environment of ecology thriving? And I think in some ways the moss became a way of sort of thinking about this hope, these small pockets of ecology that played a really important role in the biodiversity of the local area, of hosting tiny wildlife, which supports larger things like birds to live within the city, but it also holds water, slows down the movement of water within the city, and it's kind of improving our air quality. So it's this really important kind of element of the environment. And what does it mean to start a design process by care?
So it has a massive impact on the built environment, what you're doing.
I suppose something I'm also quite interested in as a plant is it's every day, and you can find it, it's not this really rare element that has to be kind of flown in from far away. The best moss in your area will be the moss that's already growing there. You can find it almost everywhere, and yet it's so kind of overlooked. We very rarely kind of think at that scale to look that closely at something so small. And through these sort of workshops, how can we improve the ecology of our spaces in like big ways in terms, we can add things to them. As a kind of designer, as an architect, I'm always thinking about how, how can we enhance, build on what this place is already like to kind of improve it, but also in terms of how we have an ongoing relationship of care. I think one of the things I've been quite interested in is one of the sort of, I suppose from my research, one of the biggest impacts of the workshop, we added seats and planters and sort of like chalkboards and sort of playful activities into the lane, and that could also, there were these frames that residents could use to hook different things onto their back walls to think about the lane as a play space. We also drew a microscopic image of moss on the ground using sort of the markings traditionally used on roads, working with a local artist, Helen. I suppose to me seemed like more traditional architectural elements. But one of the biggest impacts, or the thing I was most interested in, was actually how we change people's behaviour. So by talking about the value of moss, how did it change how people would then think about moss they found on their property, in their garden, in the lane? Not as a kind of sign of a neglect that needs to be taken out, but actually a really important element of ecology, a really important sort of element of the environment. And through the sort of the process of the co-design and thinking about moss, how did that change the way people thought about how they cared for the space, and how we can think with moss as a way of thinking about what do we want to invite in, what do we want to look after within our green spaces. And actually sometimes it's that kind of those small scale acts of care of sort of, leaving moss growing in the kind of cracks of the pavement that actually can have a really important impact in terms of how we think about support the sort of biodiversity in cities.
What is the role, what is the age of the residents in the project?
In the play lanes, we really wanted to meet as many residents as possible, tell people about the project, but also keep that process really open so they could define what the project could be like. What were they most interested in happening within their lane, within their street? We started kind of collecting ideas for what people were interested in adding to their lane, how they thought about how the lane could be improved in the future. And then through that process, we sort of mapped out all the ideas that we collected according to how possible they were. So, there were some great ideas that just weren't possible within the budget, or also within the nature of the lane, because residents can access them with their cars, so we couldn't enclose the space, or we had to kind of keep the space open. So really that's why we focused on thinking about the walls of the lane, of how we can improve it by adding elements to residents' walls. So we collected all these ideas. We mapped out how possible they were, and then also as a group how desirable they were. So what ideas most stood out, that were the most important. And based on that process, we developed kind of a strap line for the two lanes. And it really focused on greener. That was a really important thing for almost all residents, how it could become a greener space, a safer space. So thinking about how you could make children feel safe within the space, but also safer in terms of the kind of the properties that backed onto the street. And then also a cleaner space. So how we could stop people's fly tipping, clear up the space, and then make it kind of, and in turn, how that could make it make people feel safer within the space. Developed a series of sort of cartoons around what could happen within the space based on that kind of discussion with residents. And then that formed the kind of framework for the ideas that we were proposing within the lane. So then residents could sign up depending on what they were most interested in so what they'd like to add to the back of their walls to kind of improve the play lanes. And all of this has it's informed a toolkit which is now it's going to be put on Cardiff Council website that different residents can download and use to think about how they could run a kind of co-design process with their neighbours to think about how they could create a collective vision for the lane at the back of their houses, and how they could also make improvements to that space.
What was the residents' children's involvement in the project?
The project came through Child Friendly City, so we were really interested in this idea of how we could make it a more child-friendly space. I think what's also really exciting, amazing, with the way Child Friendly City is talked about, a better city for children is a better city. Actually, when we make things more accessible, more playful, clearer, that's better for everyone. That's not just something we're aiming at kind of working with children. So that was, I suppose, the starting point, how we were thinking about the project as well. And one of the sort of feedback we got from residents, from children, but I also went into some primary schools and we're talking to children there. It was just after lockdown, and actually lots of the children were interested in this idea of how we could have a space for quiet play. In a way, they were talking about, well, there are already parks nearby. We can go to the park and we can play football or we can play basketball. And I think maybe having just come out of lockdown, living in kind of quite full, noisy houses, homeschooling, children were talking about they wanted actually a space where they could be quiet, where they could have some sort of a space where they could sit and be on and play in a very different way. And that was really important in terms of the project. So thinking about how we could create these kind of spaces for quiet play. And again, I think nature is really interesting, thinking about kind of more than human playmates. How can gardening and growing become a form of a sort of a playful activity? But also within the workshops. So we ran activities within workshops within the lane. So there was a kind of moss tile making workshop. We also did like rubbings where we looked at the different textures of the existing lane. And we chalked out on the road what drawings about what could happen within the space. And I'm really interested within my practice as part of public works of how we work with children, how children are really fantastic at imagining how things can be changed and improved. They're really good at thinking imaginatively about space. And in some ways, actually a lot better than adults. Adults sometimes within participatory processes can get really hooked on what doesn't work, what is kind of failing or could be needs to be improved. And I think children are really, really good at thinking imaginatively about how that space could be really totally radically different. So within my practice, I do a lot of workshops with children as a sort of as a way of collecting ideas and thinking about how we could improve an area of space. Also, children are really good at kind of found within the moss workshops. They were really good at kind of imagining the environment, the ecology of the space different, thinking about themselves from the perspective of moss. Thinking at different scales. If the moss was a kind of forest that they were walking through, actually, how would the lane be different? Thinking about how a bird would move through the space. I suppose, again, that sort of imaginative play is a way of really thinking about ecology. And that became a way to then also talk with parents and adults around how we could think about the ecology of the space and meet their parents and sort of discuss the project.
So I imagine, as you were talking about very hands-on sort of approach, the kids are along with you kind of making a lot of those things and coming up with their own ideas.
Exactly. And I think, so we started, the project started with visioning. So we were sort of thinking, collecting ideas of what could happen. But then towards the end, as we started to develop design proposals, we had a prototyping event. So we were thinking about how we could make these changes, how we could make these improvements to the space. So we put up these frames that went on the back of residents' house, the back garden. And we thought about what we could attach to those frames. So we brought loads of cardboard into the lane and we're kind of cutting up and taping together cardboard to think about how we could make planters, how we could make homes for wildlife, what they might look like, how we might construct them. And I think that idea of sort of hands-on experimental making as a way of sort of collecting ideas and starting to understand what's also possible within a space once you have a kind of vision for what you want to achieve is also something, I'm really interested within my practice. But I really love doing, again, with children in terms of that sort of experimental creative approach to making.
What is the knowledge that you are trying to achieve with your PhD studies?
From an academic point of view, so there's ecofeminism, which is this idea of how do we think with the more than human, how do we create relationships of care between the human and the non-human. And then within anthropology, ideas of multi-species ethnography, which is kind of similarly this idea of more than human storytelling. How do we think with the more than human to understand our existing ethnography, our kind of culture and society? And so these exist as kind of theories within academia, but I'm really interested in what would it mean to try and practice that? What would it mean to apply those ideas within a sort of a live environment? So when we're thinking about what the kind of the nature of a place is, what the culture of a place is, how can we think with the more than human, and what does that bring to that process as a practice opposed to as a kind of more of a theoretical theory? And within I think this is really important, this idea of how do we conceive or think about our relationship with nature, and how does that start to inform how we're responding to things like the climate crisis, responding to the kind of crisis around biodiversity, and the kind of our growing kind of concern about our relationship with the environment. And in the next 50 years, there's obviously got to be a huge amount of kind of change in how we think about how we relate to nature. And so, what would a practice of thinking with the more than human, thinking with plants and animals within how we think about our natural environment, how can that operate, and how can that support the way in which we understand our relationship with nature, and then develop actions, ideas, designs, proposals in response to that understanding of how we relate to nature. And then finally, within the kind of Welsh context, there has been a new piece of legislation called the Future Generations Act, which is a really exciting, amazing policy in Wales, which is kind of looking at this idea of how can we holding ourselves accountable to our future generations. So any action today can't compromise the lives of future generations. And in that, there is a clear link with kind of young people and children as a future, but also this idea of, how do we really hold ourselves accountable to the growing environmental crises that we're experiencing? And again, I think what's really amazing, exciting about the Future Generations Act is the commitment to this as a sort of policy by Cardiff Council. And now there's a lot of really exciting work exploring, well, what does that mean on the ground? How can we hold ourselves accountable? How does that play out? What does that actually really mean in terms of how we approach our built environments, our rural areas, how we approach transport, how we think about kind of food and consumption? And so I'm really interested in within sort of participation and co-design, which is such an important bit of architecture and architectural design. How do we think about the natural resources and the effect that these kind of proposed changes to the built environment will have on our natural resources? How can participatory processes develop and evolve to really address nature as a kind of stakeholder within this process?
Sean will be very much part of that co-design and participatory design that you're looking at in your PhD.
Absolutely. So I suppose in a kind of, so I'm working on live projects, the fact we were working with child-friendly cities, that became a kind of focus for the work. But I think before that, I was already working a lot with children. I think they're really key in terms of co-design, how we work with others within sort of co-design processes. Like I said before, in terms of their imagination. But then, like you say, I think in terms of the environmental agenda, it's really interesting how young people and children are at the sort of forefront in terms of how are we going to live differently in the future, and how can we develop more resilient and regenerative forms of living.
And become more conscious about the actions we do. Is there a question I should have asked you that I haven't asked you? And what is that question?
You could ask me about my placement, which I am currently completing in the Child Friendly Cities Department as part of Cardiff Council. So as I said before, I sort of met, they funded the Play Lanes project, and I've been working with them around sort of developing this toolkit, thinking about how, which sets out a sort of framework for other residents to run co-design processes, thinking about how they can improve the lanes at the back of their houses, working with their neighbours to create a kind of common vision for what this space could be like. But within this toolkit, I'm also interested in how at different points we can think about ecology, think about moss as a way of thinking about the sort of natural environment, nature that already exists in the lane, and how we can support and improve it. So this placement with Child Friendly Cities is looking at how improving this toolkit, getting feedback on the toolkit, but also thinking about how this sort of method might sit within other sort of participatory processes within the council, can be used within other sort of design processes where we work with groups. I'm talking to different members of the council and thinking about how do they approach participation, how might we kind of work with focus on young people and address the environment as part of those processes. One thing I'm also doing, so the other thing that Child Friendly Cities does, is sort of it supports, develops projects that engage with young people within around their sort of the children's rights. So Child Friendly Cities are looking at becoming the capital of play, UNICEF's capital of play, putting children's rights, children's ability to inform and impact the built environment at the kind of the centre of that. And so again, I think, how do you set processes that work with children are really important as part of that kind of design processes. They also have the Youth Forum. So this is a group of young people who meet monthly to give, and they give feedback on the kind of policy and ideas that are being developed by the council. And again, I suppose what's really interesting with that is there's a really clear environmental agenda that's coming from those young people, and they're sort of holding, in some ways, the council to account. So they're giving them feedback on the ideas that are emerging, and also highlighting things that might be overlooked or need to be given more attention. I'm interested in working with young people to get feedback on the Play Lanes document, so improving play spaces within the city, at the back of residents' houses, but also developing participatory co-design methods, working with residents and neighbourhoods, where we think about the sort of the more than human, the natural environment as part of those processes. And we make that really key to kind of how we're approaching designing and improving space. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much to my guest today, to all the listeners, and please subscribe to Architecture for Kids podcast and leave your rating and a review. Recommend us to your friends and family. And to find out more about it, visit our websites, antoniocaplan-portfolio.co.uk, buildingcentre.co.uk, thorntoneducationtrust.org, cardiff.ac.uk, and follow us on Instagram, Arch for Kids CIC, Twitter, @Kaplan, LinkedIn, @Kaplan, CAPELAO. And please join me again next week for another episode of Architecture for Kids podcast, brought to you in collaboration with the Built Environment Trust, the Thornton Education Trust, and the Welsh School of Architecture, Cardiff University.